Place de Grève, Paris, March 28, 1757. The late winter cold grips the city as a crowd of more than 10,000 people gathers in the freezing morning. Breath fogging in the March air. The largest public execution in decades. Grandstands have been constructed. Windows in surrounding buildings have been rented for exorbitant prices, 50 livres for a single window overlooking the scaffold. Entire families have come through the cold streets. They brought food as if it were a festival, because they are not here to witness a quick hanging or even a relatively merciful decapitation in the freezing March weather. They are here to see Robert-Francois Damiens, the 42-year-old man who attempted to assassinate King Louis XV, undergo a punishment that has not been applied for generations, an execution so extreme that when the details were explained to the assistant executioners, 3 of them resigned immediately: Jean Martin, Pierre Duchamp, and Francois Leblanc said they would rather lose their jobs than participate in this. And when Damiens is brought to the platform in the bitter March morning, shivering from cold and terror, the process that is about to begin will last more than 4 hours. 4 hours of calculated agony in the freezing air, of methods designed to maximize suffering before allowing death. And in the end, even the crowd accustomed to public violence will be sickened, some fainting in the cold, others vomiting, because there is a limit to what humans can bear to witness. And the execution of Damiens will spectacularly exceed that limit. Today, you will discover the true story of the last execution by dismemberment in France, not the sanitized version from history books that briefly mention severe punishment, but the reality documented in eyewitness accounts, including Giacomo Casanova, who watched from a rented window and recorded every horrified detail. How Damiens, a disturbed man who slightly wounded the king with a small penknife on a January afternoon, was transformed into an example that the state wanted to use to demonstrate what happened to regicides, and how the brutality of the execution ended up having the opposite effect. Instead of terrorizing the population into obedience, it caused revulsion that accelerated reforms. The story begins on the frozen afternoon of January 5, 1757. Robert-Francois Damiens, a 42-year-old former soldier and domestic servant, approached King Louis XV at Versailles as the king was entering his carriage in the winter darkness. Damiens had a knife, a small one, a penknife really, and he stabbed the king once in the side between the ribs. The wound was superficial. The king wore multiple layers of clothing because of the January cold heavy wool coats, waistcoats, linen shirts. The knife penetrated only a few centimeters through all those winter layers. It bled, but not severely. The king recovered completely within weeks. But the crime was not measured by physical damage. It was an attempt to assassinate a monarch anointed by God. The crime of lèse majesté, the most serious possible, and the punishment had been codified in law since 1348. Execution by dismemberment. Damiens was captured immediately, taken to the Conciergerie prison, and tortured for weeks during January and February to extract a confession and the names of co-conspirators. He insisted he acted alone, that he was mentally disturbed, that voices told him to attack the king because the church and parliament were in conflict and the king was not resolving it. It made no sense. He was clearly unstable, but the authorities wanted a conspiracy. So the torture continued through the winter cold. Spanish boots, iron frameworks that crushed his legs progressively, breaking bones joint by joint. Water torture forced down his throat until his abdomen distended, his stomach stretched to bursting. Then beaten to force the water out, then filled again. But he had no names to give because there was no conspiracy. The trial in early March was a formality. Conviction was guaranteed. On March 26, 1757, the sentence was read. When Damiens heard the details, he collapsed in his cell. He begged for mercy. But there was none. The sentence was specific, explicit, and it would follow the royal ordinance of 1348 regarding the punishment of regicides. On the morning of March 28, Damiens was taken to Place de Grève in the freezing pre-dawn darkness. The crowd was already waiting, stamping their feet against the March cold. A platform had been erected overnight, and the instruments were arranged. Pincers, cauldrons of molten lead kept liquid over braziers, boiling oil, burning resin, liquid sulfur, 4 horses stamping in the cold, and a wheel to break bones if necessary. The chief executioner was Charles-Henri Sanson, from a family that would execute in Paris for generations. But even he was visibly disturbed by what the law required, his breath fogging as he checked the instruments in the March morning. The first phase was public torture before death. Damiens was stripped to the waist. In the freezing air, his skin already mottled purple and white from the winter cold and weeks of dungeon imprisonment. He was tied to a post on the platform, shivering violently. Pincers heated until red hot in the braziers were used to tear his flesh. His chest first, the executioner gripped muscle and twisted, tearing away pieces the size of coins. Then arms. Then thighs. As Damiens screamed, the executioners poured a mixture of molten lead, boiling oil, resin, and sulfur into the open wounds. The objective was to cause maximum pain while partially cauterizing to prevent death by bleeding. They wanted him conscious for the next phase. The contrast between the March cold and the boiling liquids created clouds of steam that rose from Damiens' body. Casanova, watching from a rented window above the square, wrote that Damiens' screams were inhuman, like nothing I have heard from man or beast. The crowd initially shouted insults, "Die," "Traitor," "Regicide," but gradually fell silent because it was becoming too much even for spectators accustomed to public violence. Some began to leave through the frozen streets. Others could not look away. And Damiens, after 20 minutes of torture with hot metal and boiling liquids in the freezing March air, was still conscious, still screaming. The second phase was dismemberment. The method used was drawing the same technique used on English traders. Ropes were tied to each limb, arms, and legs. 4 horses were positioned, 1 for each rope, their breath steaming in the March cold. At the signal, the horses were whipped. They pulled. The tension increased. Damiens' bones cracked the sound audible to the front rows of the crowd. Joints began to dislocate, shoulders first, then hips. The ball and socket joints separating with wet pops, but the limbs did not separate. The horses pulled for more than half an hour in the freezing air. Damiens screamed continuously, his voice growing hoarse. But the human body is surprisingly resilient. Tendons and ligaments are incredibly strong, designed to hold joints together under enormous stress. The executioners added 2 horses, 6 in total now. They pulled again for another 45 minutes, and still the limbs remained attached